So let's take a look quickly at the other storage options that are available to us. We're not always going to use shared preferences because they're not always the right thing to use. For storing most user settings, shared preferences are going to make sense, and they're certainly the easiest thing to use in Android for saving data and retrieving it if you need to save and retrieve persistent data. But there are some other options that are available to us when shared preferences aren't going to work. The first one is internal storage. And it's basically a lot like isolated storage. If you're familiar with the concept of isolated storage, it's basically some storage area that only your application can access. It's like a sandbox for your application. And that's what internal storage essentially is. It allows you to basically write to disk, but an area that only your application can access. And with isolated storage, it's going to be removed from the device when your app is removed. So it really is part of your application. And the way that you use that is basically just like writing to any file on the file system. When you use the internal storage, you call a method that basically opens file output that you can then put your data into, write to a file, and then you can read that file back out. And you can set access rights on it so that other apps can read it or not. The next option is external storage. And this is very much like internal storage. The only difference is that instead of being internal in like a sandbox or isolated storage for your application, it's external, and it's usually going to be like on the SD card or some other user accessible app location. Not all Android phones are going to have an SD card, but they're always going to have some kind of external storage. And you can think of it this way as it's an area where if you mount your Android phone through a USB cable, this is the external storage. What you see when you mount it, that's the area that you'd be writing to here. So you have to be a little bit careful here because this data is going to be available to the user. So you don't really want to store secure data there that you don't want the user to be able to have access to, or some kind of internal data that if they edited it, they could hack your application or something like that. You always want to check before using the external storage to make sure it's available, because it might not be available. For example, if they've mounted their external storage via USB, you're not going to be able to write to it. And then there's some Android specific directories that are available, like a ringtones directory or music or video, that you can use in the API for accessing external storage that will let you easily write to those directories so that any Android application that's looking for ringtones, for example, would be able to find a ringtone that you wrote to the external storage. The final option is a database. And this option, I recommend that you really think about whether or not you need to use it, because it adds a considerable amount of complexity to your application. Now, in a lot of instances, databases are the way to go, but you just have to weigh how much extra work that you're going to have to do in order to get data from the database, because you're not going to get a lot of help here. The database is basically a SQLite database, which is a common compact database that is used on mobile devices. And there is a SQLite 3 tool that is included with your Android development kit that will make things a little bit easier for you to query the database that's on the Android phone. But it's still a little difficult to do. There's some other tools that you can use to work with SQLite databases, but we're not going to go into that here. You basically are going to have to create and delete your own tables. So you have to be ready for that and write the SQL to be able to do that. And then you'll access the database. The queries will basically return cursors, which you'll iterate over to get the data from. This is a pretty advanced topic. We'll probably cover this in a different course, because you could really talk a lot about how to access the database and how to use that in Android. One other thing that you might use a database for is if you're creating a custom content provider, which we haven't talked about a lot yet, but is basically a way to query sets of data to like use a URI to get, for example, all the contacts on the phone. This is a good use for that as a database.